My name is Bianca, and I'm 27 years old. I never imagined that one of the most painful memories of my life would happen on a night that was supposed to be about joy and celebration. Birthdays are meant to be filled with laughter, warmth, and love. But mine became the moment that exposed the truth about my family in the harshest way possible. Before I continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world to me. That evening, I remember standing in front of a decorated table surrounded by relatives and neighbors, a cake glowing with candles in the center. The lights were dimmed, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to believe I was special. But in my family, illusions never lasted long. When my father forced my face into the cake, the cheers turned into stunned gasps and laughter. My mother's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She said I finally looked pretty. That moment, seared into my memory, was more than just humiliation. It was the breaking point that revealed the full extent of the cruelty I had endured for years. I had always known my parents didn't see me the way other families saw their daughters. Growing up, I was the shadow, the afterthought, the one who never measured up. They criticized everything: my looks, my choices, even the way I breathed. But birthdays were supposed to be different. They were the one time I hoped for kindness. Instead, it became the stage for my destruction. The sensation of the cake against my skin was suffocating. The sweetness became poison, clinging to me like evidence of my shame. Laughter echoed in the background, each sound a dagger reminding me I was entertainment, not family. My mother's words weren't just cruel. They stripped me of the last shred of dignity I thought I still possessed in their eyes. In that instant, I realized I was nothing more than their punchline. What hurt most wasn't the act itself, but the approval it received. No one defended me. No one said it was wrong. Instead, I felt the weight of their stares, silent witnesses who chose comfort over courage. The room was filled with people, but I had never felt more alone. That loneliness burned deeper than any physical sting. As the candles flickered, melting into the ruined cake, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. My family would never change. Their love wasn't love at all. It was control disguised as affection, cruelty disguised as tradition, and humiliation disguised as jokes. I had been groomed to accept less, to shrink, to believe I deserved their treatment. That night made it impossible to keep lying to myself. But pain, as brutal as it is, can be a strange teacher. Standing there, covered in frosting and shame, I made a silent vow to myself. This would not be the end of my story. If anything, it would be the beginning of my liberation. I didn't know how yet, and I didn't know when, but I promised that I would one day turn this moment into the fuel I needed to build a life where I was no longer their victim. The irony of it all was how ordinary everything looked after the chaos settled. The cake was wiped from the table, conversations resumed, and people pretended nothing had happened. But inside me, a storm had been unleashed. I carried that storm quietly, hiding it beneath polite smiles, but it followed me into every corner of my life. It changed the way I saw myself, the way I trusted others, and the way I measured worth. For years, I had begged for their approval, chasing scraps of validation like a starving child. That night, I realized approval from them was a poison I no longer wanted. They thrived on my submission, on watching me break. And if I kept allowing it, there would be no end. I had to choose something different, something terrifying, something that meant stepping away from everything I had ever known. What no one realized in that room was that humiliation can sometimes plant the seed of transformation. They thought they destroyed me, but what they really did was awaken me. For the first time, I wasn't only hurt, I was aware. I saw clearly that survival meant change, and that my revenge would never be in violence or cruelty, but in building a life that proved I was worth far more than the shame they tried to tattoo onto me. That night marked the beginning of my journey, a journey not only of escape, but of healing. It was the first step toward rewriting the narrative of my life, where I was no longer the broken daughter, but a woman reclaiming her power. And so, while my parents laughed at my pain, they unknowingly handed me the very reason I would one day walk away stronger than ever. The cake on my face may have been their joke, but it became my reason to rise. Growing up in my house felt like living in the shadows of people who never wanted to see me. From the earliest memories I can recall, I understood that I did not hold the same value as others in my family. My parents never said it outright, but their actions told the story every single day. I was the quiet background of a picture that was never meant to include me. Birthdays, holidays, even the smallest gatherings always placed someone else at the center, while I stood on the sidelines. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. At first, it was an act of survival, a way to avoid criticism or punishment. But over time, it became my identity. I believed that my worth was measured by how invisible I could make myself, how little space I could take. There were moments in my childhood when I longed desperately to be seen. I watched other children run into the arms of parents who adored them, children who received encouragement and gentle words. I tried to mimic those smiles, to earn even a fraction of that warmth. But in my home, affection was rationed like something I had never deserved. My father's attention came through harshness, and my mother's presence was laced with criticism. I learned early that hope was dangerous because it always ended in disappointment. The silence of being overlooked hurt as much as their cruelty. Sometimes it was worse. It is one thing to be punished. It is another to be treated as if you don't exist. I would sit at the table and feel my voice dissolve before it reached anyone's ears. My ideas, my feelings, my little victories, none of it mattered. I grew up surrounded by noise, yet drowned in loneliness. School became both an escape and another battlefield. Teachers noticed me only for my quietness. Other children sensed that something was different about me, and some exploited it. Without confidence or self-belief, I was easy to push aside. I carried the weight of invisibility everywhere, like a heavy coat I could never take off. But even in the silence of my family, I was always listening. I became an observer, someone who studied the room before stepping into it. I learned to read expressions, tones, and movements because I needed to anticipate what might come next. Would today bring ridicule? Would it bring indifference? Or would it bring something worse? My life became a constant rehearsal for a stage where no one wanted me to perform. I remember nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning why I had been born into this home. Children are supposed to believe their parents are their protectors, their safe place. For me, my home was the place I longed most to escape. I would imagine another life, one where birthdays meant joy, where my mistakes were lessons, not punishments, and where I could laugh without fear of ridicule. But dreaming never lasted long. Reality always came crashing back, reminding me that my place was not to be seen or celebrated. I was the forgotten child, the one no one noticed until it was convenient to use me as the target of a cruel joke or the scapegoat for someone else's mistakes. The years blended into one another, a cycle of invisibility and pain. By the time I reached my teenage years, the silence had shaped me into someone who did not expect love at all. I stopped reaching for it. I convinced myself I didn't need it. I told myself that survival was enough, even though every part of me ached for something more. Looking back now, I realize how damaging it was to grow up unseen. It twisted the way I understood relationships, the way I measured my value, and the way I believed the world worked. It made me think that cruelty was normal and that kindness was something reserved for other people, not me. But deep inside, hidden beneath all the layers of pain, a small spark remained. It was the part of me that refused to accept that invisibility was all I would ever know. That spark whispered in quiet moments, telling me that someday, somehow, I would prove that I was worthy of being seen. I didn't yet know how to listen to it, but it was there, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The truth about growing up invisible is that it leaves scars no one can see. Scars that shape the way you walk into rooms, the way you trust, the way you look at yourself in the mirror. My scars were invisible to the world, but to me, they were everywhere. They were in every thought, every hesitation, every fear that defined me. That is the weight I carried into adulthood, and it explains why that moment at my birthday, the moment when my father shoved my face into the cake and my mother laughed, cut me so deeply. It wasn't just one night of cruelty. It was the confirmation of everything I had always felt, that I was never seen, never valued, never loved. But what I didn't realize then was that sometimes being invisible teaches you to see yourself more clearly. And slowly, painfully, that is where my transformation would begin. If my father's presence in my life was defined by sudden eruptions of anger, my mother's presence was defined by a steady drip of poison that never stopped. His cruelty was violent and explosive. Hers was cold, calculated, and persistent. Where he made me fear the next outburst, she made me question the very core of who I was. If my father bruised my body, my mother bruised my spirit. Her words, her looks, her dismissive gestures, all of it built the mirror I was forced to see myself in every single day. And in that mirror, I never saw anything worth loving. My mother didn't need to raise her voice to destroy me. She could dismantle me with a single glance, a subtle shake of her head, or a sarcastic smile that told me I would never be enough. From the time I was a little girl, she created a narrative about me. Awkward, plain, second best. She compared me to other girls, to neighbors, to cousins, to imaginary standards I could never reach. Beauty, in her eyes, was a currency she possessed and I lacked, and she made sure I knew it. Every time she dressed up, every time she admired herself in the mirror, every time she reminded me of what I wasn't, the lesson was clear. I could not compete. I was destined to fall short. That moment at my birthday, when she laughed and said I finally looked pretty with cake covering my face, was not new. It was simply the cruelest and most public version of what she had been doing to me my entire life. She had always made me believe that my value existed only in contrast to hers, and that I would never measure up. Her cruelty didn't come in sharp bursts. It was a constant undertone, an atmosphere I could never escape. If I tried to celebrate a small victory, she found a way to diminish it. If I wanted to feel good about myself, she reminded me of my flaws. Over time, I internalized her voice until it became indistinguishable from my own. I didn't just hear her criticisms. I repeated them to myself, believing they were the truth. The cruelest thing about gaslighting is that it makes you doubt your own perception of reality. My mother could spend years making me feel unworthy, and then, in a single moment, act as though she was being supportive, confusing me into questioning whether I was simply too sensitive. That confusion was part of the trap. It kept me tethered to her approval, constantly chasing something I would never receive. Looking back now, I realize how deeply damaging it was to grow up with a mother who viewed me as competition instead of a daughter. She didn't nurture me. She dissected me. She didn't guide me. She undermined me. She didn't celebrate me. She used me as a reminder of her superiority. That kind of relationship doesn't just wound you. It rewires you. It makes you believe that every kind word must have a hidden edge, that every act of love must come with a condition, that you are always being measured and found lacking. The mirror she built for me became a prison. I could never look at myself without hearing her judgments. Even as I grew older and tried to carve out a sense of identity, her reflection lingered, whispering that I was unworthy, unattractive, undeserving. The worst part was how natural it felt. Pain was not an exception in my home. It was the rule. And because of that, I didn't know how to imagine life any other way. But there was a strange paradox buried in her cruelty. By constantly trying to reduce me, my mother forced me to develop an inner world that she could not reach. In that hidden space, I began to nurture the faintest belief that perhaps I was more than what her mirror reflected. It was not confidence yet. It was survival. A quiet resistance born from the need to preserve some piece of myself she couldn't corrupt. Of course, that resistance didn't make me immune to the damage. For years, I carried her voice with me everywhere I went. In every social setting, I questioned if people saw me the way she did. In every photograph, I searched for the flaws she would have pointed out. In every achievement, I waited for the dismissive shrug I had come to expect. I didn't need her to be in the room. She lived inside me, a ghost that haunted my every thought. The cruelty of my mother was not just about words. It was about what those words stole from me. They stole my ability to see myself clearly. They stole my confidence, my joy, my belief that I was worthy of love without conditions. And they stole my trust in others. Because if the person who gave me life could so easily dismantle me, how could I ever expect strangers to treat me differently? And yet, even within that twisted mirror, cracks began to form. Over time, I started to realize that her obsession with tearing me down said more about her than it did about me. A mother who feels the need to compete with her child is not strong. She is broken. A woman who defines herself only by diminishing others is not powerful. She is fragile. I didn't fully understand it then, but I began to sense that her cruelty was not a reflection of my lack, but of her own emptiness. That realization would not free me overnight. It would take years of unlearning, of rebuilding, of fighting to replace her voice with my own. But the seed had been planted. Even as her mirror tried to distort me, I began to understand that I could build a new one. A mirror where my worth was not defined by her approval, but by my own growth, my own choices, my own resilience. And though I could not see it clearly yet, the day would come when I would finally shatter her cruel reflection and see myself as I truly was. Not broken, not unworthy, but whole. If my mother's cruelty was a constant drip, my father's was a storm that struck without warning. His anger lived in the walls of our home, unpredictable yet familiar, always lurking just beyond the surface. I never knew what would trigger it. Sometimes it was something I did, sometimes it was nothing at all. But when it erupted, it consumed the entire house. As a child, I became an expert at scanning his moods, trying to sense when the next eruption was coming. The way his footsteps hit the floor, the way he opened a door, even the silence in his breathing told me what I needed to know. Living with him meant living on edge, waiting for the inevitable thunder. The fear of what might happen was sometimes worse than the violence itself, because it made every moment a battlefield. But what made those storms unbearable was not just his rage. It was my mother's reaction to it. She didn't flinch. She didn't protect me. She didn't even look away. She reveled in it, as if his anger was proof that I deserved every ounce of cruelty I received. If he struck me with words or with actions, she stood by as the approving witness. In her eyes, his anger validated everything she already believed about me. That partnership between them was the deepest wound of all. My father's anger could have been written off as a flaw, a weakness, a failure of control. But my mother's approval gave it legitimacy. It told me that my suffering wasn't just his temper, it was the family's verdict on who I was. Every time she smirked, every time she looked satisfied while I crumbled, it etched into me the belief that I was the problem, that I was defective, that I deserved it. It is one thing to endure violence. It is another to endure violence accompanied by applause. The two of them created a theater in which I was always the main act, humiliated and broken under the gaze of people who should have been my protectors. Their cruelty was not separate. It was synchronized. His rage fed her satisfaction, and her satisfaction fueled his rage. Together, they created a cycle I could not escape. As I grew older, I began to notice how rehearsed it all felt. My father's anger always had an audience, and my mother was always ready to provide the reaction. It was as if they needed each other to keep the performance alive. If he lashed out in private, she made sure to remind me of it later, reinforcing the lesson. If she criticized me, his fury followed, giving weight to her words. It was a collaboration, unspoken, but undeniable. That dynamic shaped the way I saw myself for years. I stopped questioning whether their actions were right or wrong. I accepted them as truth, as the natural order of things. I believed that I was the defective piece in the puzzle, the one who somehow caused the storms and deserved the punishment. I carried their verdict like a sentence, serving time in a prison I hadn't built. But the more I look back, the more I see how much power they gained from keeping me in that role. By turning me into the scapegoat, they deflected their own brokenness. My father didn't have to confront his lack of control. My mother didn't have to face her emptiness. Together, they made me the vessel for everything they refused to face in themselves. And in their twisted logic, it worked. As long as I believed I was the problem, they could remain untouchable. The most haunting part of that arrangement was how normal it felt. Outsiders might have seen cruelty, but for me, it was simply life. The violence, the criticism, the approval of my pain, all of it blended into the fabric of my days. I didn't expect safety or kindness. I didn't even imagine it anymore. I measured success not by moments of joy, but by the rare hours of calm when storms didn't erupt. Living like that leaves scars that don't fade easily. Even when I left the room, even when the storms paused, I carried the weight of their judgment with me. I replayed the scenes in my head, wondering what I could have done differently to avoid them. I searched for the flaw in myself that made me deserving of such treatment. And each time I found nothing, I convinced myself I simply hadn't looked hard enough. The night of my birthday, when my father shoved my face into the cake and my mother laughed, was just one act in the play they had been performing my entire life. It was shocking, yes, but it was also familiar. It was the perfect example of their choreography, his violence, her approval, and my humiliation as the centerpiece. That night didn't create the pattern. It revealed it in its purest form. The truth I later came to understand was painful but necessary. I had been raised not just by a cruel father and a critical mother, but by a partnership that thrived on my suffering. Their bond was built on my destruction. And while that realization cut deeply, it also gave me clarity. I could never change them. I could never make them love me the way I longed to be loved. My only path forward would be to step outside of their performance and refuse to play the role they had written for me. For years, I didn't know how to do that. I only knew I needed to. And that knowledge, fragile and terrifying as it was, became the first step toward breaking the cycle they had created. The night of my birthday was not just about what my parents did to me. It was also about what everyone else failed to do. When my father shoved my face into the cake and my mother laughed as if it were the highlight of the evening, the silence that followed from the people around me was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Relatives, neighbors, and family friends stood only a few feet away, their eyes wide, their hands frozen mid-air, their mouths slightly open. For a moment, I thought someone would intervene. I thought an aunt might step forward, or a cousin might say something, or at the very least someone would break the tension with a word of comfort. But no one did. Their silence spread through the room like a thick fog, suffocating me more than the frosting clinging to my face. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in their eyes. They saw what happened. They watched my humiliation. And instead of challenging it, they chose complicity. Whether out of fear, discomfort, or loyalty to my parents, they did nothing. In that inaction, they delivered the harshest verdict of all, that I was not worth defending. The sting of my father's hand forcing me down into the cake faded quickly compared to the sting of their indifference. Pain inflicted by one person can be endured, but when an entire room stands by and allows it, the wound deepens into something far more permanent. It becomes a confirmation that your suffering is not important, that you are alone even when surrounded by people. As I wiped the frosting from my eyes that night, I scanned the room, desperate for a single face of compassion. But what I saw instead were lowered gazes, forced smiles, and awkward attempts to move on. Plates were shifted, conversations resumed, laughter returned, as if erasing my humiliation could be done by pretending it had never happened. Yet I felt it clinging to me, heavy and inescapable. That was the nature of my family: silence in the face of cruelty, indifference in the face of pain. They might whisper about it later behind closed doors, but in the moment, no one dared to break the image my parents had carefully built. They were the center of authority, and no one wanted to stand against them. Their silence was not just about me, it was about their fear of losing favor, of disrupting the order. And so they let me fall alone. It is difficult to explain how silence can be louder than words, but that night, it screamed in my ears. It screamed that I was isolated, that even those who claimed to care about me would choose comfort over courage. It screamed that my suffering was acceptable entertainment as long as it kept the peace for everyone else. And it screamed that I could never expect salvation to come from outside myself. That realization changed me. It hardened something inside, but it also awakened a truth I could no longer ignore. I had to become my own protector. If no one else was willing to stand for me, then I had to find the strength to stand for myself. It was terrifying, because up until then, my survival had depended on staying quiet and invisible. But invisibility had never saved me. It had only allowed others to erase me more easily. The silence of my family shaped me as much as the cruelty of my parents. It taught me how loneliness could exist even in a crowded room. It showed me how betrayal could come not only from actions, but also from the lack of them. And it made me understand the true cost of complicity, that when people stand by, they become part of the cruelty itself. Looking back now, I see how deeply that silence cut into me. It made me distrustful of groups, wary of gatherings, skeptical of kindness. I learned to scan for exits, to anticipate humiliation, to expect abandonment. I carried that vigilance into adulthood, always waiting for the moment when others would turn away and leave me to fall. The wound of silence does not heal easily, because it comes not from one hand but from many, layered until it feels infinite. But silence can also be instructive. It showed me exactly who I could not count on. It revealed the truth behind the polite smiles and hollow embraces. It stripped away the illusion of family loyalty and left me with the bare reality that blood ties mean nothing without action, without courage, without love. And in that painful revelation, I began to understand that freedom would not come from convincing them to see me. Freedom would come from learning to see myself, even when they refused to. The night of my birthday became more than a memory. It became a turning point. As I stood in that room, covered in frosting and shame, surrounded by people who said nothing, I realized that silence can be the deepest cruelty of all. It leaves no marks on the skin, but it carves scars into the soul, and those scars remain long after the laughter has faded. Their silence was supposed to break me. Instead, it became the fuel for my determination to escape. I would not let their indifference define me forever. If they refused to speak for me, then I would one day speak for myself. If they refused to defend me, then I would learn to defend myself. And if they refused to see me, then I would make sure that one day my life would shine so brightly that their silence would no longer matter. That promise took root in me that night, a vow born not of anger, but of necessity, because I knew then that silence could destroy me only if I allowed it, and I refused to give it that power. For years, my world had been defined by the walls of my family's home. Those walls echoed with anger, criticism, and silence, leaving little room for me to breathe. Yet even in that suffocating environment, I began to sense that survival required more than endurance. If I stayed only within those walls, I would disappear entirely. I needed to find something beyond them, however small, that could remind me I was more than the scapegoat they had created. My first escape was not dramatic. It was not running away in the middle of the night or cutting ties in an instant. It was quieter, subtler, and yet just as powerful. It began with the realization that the outside world offered spaces where my parents' voices could not reach me. At school, in books, in part-time jobs, and in the company of strangers, I found glimpses of a different version of myself, one that wasn't defined solely by their cruelty. School had never been easy, but it became a refuge in ways I hadn't expected. While I was never the most outgoing or confident student, the classroom gave me structure, and within that structure, I found a sense of control. Unlike home, where rules were designed to break me, school offered rules that, if followed, could actually reward me. Completing assignments, studying late at night, and bringing home grades that no one celebrated still gave me something my parents couldn't take away: the quiet knowledge that I was capable. Their indifference stung, but it also made me realize that my achievements were for me, not for them. Books became my secret allies. Each page opened a world far from my own, a place where characters faced trials but often emerged stronger. Reading was not simply entertainment, it was survival. In the stories of others, I glimpsed resilience. I learned that pain could be endured, that circumstances could change, and that people could become more than the roles they had been forced into. Even though my reality felt fixed, books whispered that transformation was possible. As I grew older, I found new forms of escape through work. My first part-time job, though small and ordinary, felt monumental. It wasn't about the money at first, it was about freedom. Stepping into a workplace where no one knew me as the daughter who wasn't enough gave me a chance to build an identity separate from the one my parents had forced onto me. Each shift was more than labor. It was a step toward independence. Earning my own money, no matter how little, gave me a taste of autonomy. I could buy something without their permission, make a choice without their approval, and for once, control a piece of my life. There was a certain thrill in holding my own earnings in my hands. It felt like proof that I was not powerless, that I could shape my own path in small increments. That realization planted a seed inside me. If I could create even a little distance, then perhaps one day I could create much more. Even friendships, though fragile and complicated, became another form of escape. While I never felt fully able to open up about what happened at home, being with others allowed me to step outside the role I had been assigned within my family. I wasn't just the target of ridicule or anger. I could be someone who listened, someone who shared a laugh, someone who was seen without cruelty. Those moments, however fleeting, were reminders that my parents' perception of me was not the only truth that existed. These small escapes became lifelines. They didn't erase the pain of home, but they gave me glimpses of what life could be. And with each glimpse, my resolve grew. I began to see my parents not as the ultimate authority, but as people trapped in their own brokenness. Their power over me depended on my silence, on my belief that I had no other world to belong to. But every book, every class, every paycheck reminded me that there was, in fact, another world, one where I could exist differently. Of course, the weight of my home life still followed me. I couldn't shed it completely. Even when I was surrounded by others, I often felt the echo of my mother's criticisms and my father's rage. I carried their voices like shadows, whispering that I didn't belong anywhere, that I would eventually be exposed as unworthy. Yet despite the heaviness, I kept searching for cracks in the walls, places where light could seep in. What I found in those cracks was the beginning of resilience. I didn't know it at the time, but resilience is often born quietly, in small decisions, in hidden acts of defiance. Choosing to study when no one cared. Choosing to save a little money when no one noticed. Choosing to believe, if only faintly, that I was capable of more. Those choices were my rebellion, even if they didn't look like rebellion to anyone else. The greatest lesson of that period in my life was that escape doesn't always come in one sweeping moment. Sometimes it comes in fragments, 10 stolen minutes of peace, a job that pays just enough to imagine independence, a book that whispers of courage. My parents thought they had locked me into their cycle of cruelty forever, but they didn't realize that I was quietly building another world in parallel. Piece by piece, step by step, I was creating the foundation of the life I would one day claim fully as my own. That knowledge sustained me. Even when I returned home each night to the same suffocating atmosphere, I carried the small victories with me like hidden treasures. They were proof that I could endure, that I could carve out space for myself, and that my parents' definition of me was not permanent. Finding my first escape didn't mean I was free. Not yet. But it meant I knew freedom existed. And once you know it exists, no amount of cruelty can make you unsee it. Growing older meant more than simply adding years to my life. It meant gaining the distance I needed to see my family's patterns with clarity. For so long, I had been trapped inside the cycle, spinning endlessly in the rhythm of my father's rage and my mother's cruelty. But as I began stepping further into adulthood, the rhythm started to break. I began to hear the silence between the beats, the pauses where choice could exist. That silence became my opportunity to imagine a life outside of their control. Independence didn't arrive all at once. It came through small victories, like earning enough money to pay for my own necessities or staying late at work to avoid going home. These small acts of defiance created spaces where their voices couldn't reach me. For the first time, I could walk into a store and buy something I wanted without needing permission. That freedom, however minor it seemed, was monumental to me. It was proof that I could exist without their approval. Yet breaking the cycle was not as simple as leaving. Even as I took steps forward, invisible chains pulled me back. Guilt was one of them. No matter how cruel they had been, they were still my parents, and the weight of that bond was not easy to sever. I told myself that leaving them behind made me ungrateful, that independence meant betrayal. The guilt twisted my progress into hesitation, making me wonder if I was selfish for wanting a life they hadn't given me. Fear was another chain. My father's voice echoed in my mind whenever I imagined cutting ties, warning me of consequences I couldn't fully define. My mother's smirk haunted me, as if daring me to try and fail. Even when they weren't physically present, they lived inside me, their influence woven into the fabric of my decisions. It wasn't just about what they had done to me. It was about what they had made me believe about myself. And undoing that belief was the hardest work of all. Still, each step toward independence strengthened me. I began to notice how different I felt when I was away from them. In places where their control didn't extend, I laughed more easily, breathed more freely, even stood taller. It was as though my body recognized safety before my mind allowed me to trust it. The contrast was undeniable. In their presence, I shrank. Away from them, I grew. That contrast became my motivation. If I could feel like this for a few hours, why couldn't I feel like it all the time? There was also the realization that their cycle wasn't unique to me. I started to see how they repeated it with each other, feeding off one another's cruelty, locked in a performance that had nothing to do with love. They had chosen this cycle for themselves, but I no longer had to accept being part of it. Their bond was built on destruction, but I was not required to play the role they had written for me. Recognizing that truth was like finding the key to a door I hadn't known existed. Still, breaking the cycle wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a single declaration or an explosive confrontation. It happened slowly, in quiet choices. I spent more time at work. I took on responsibilities that kept me away from home. I saved money in secret, watching the small pile grow as if it were my ticket to freedom. And with each step, I felt a little stronger, a little less bound to their control. The hardest part was learning to redefine what family meant. For years, I believed family was obligation, sacrifice, and endurance. But slowly, I began to realize that family is supposed to be safety, encouragement, and love. If my own family couldn't provide that, then I had the right to build it elsewhere, with friends, mentors, or even within myself. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened the hold my parents had over me. It reminded me that I was allowed to seek better. The cycle had shaped me, but it did not have to define me forever. I began to imagine a future where my worth wasn't determined by their judgment. A future where I could walk into a room without bracing for humiliation. A future where birthdays meant celebration, not shame. These visions, fragile as they were, gave me the strength to continue stepping forward. But even as I broke pieces of the cycle, I carried its weight. It lingered in the way I second-guessed myself, in the hesitation I felt when accepting kindness from others, in the constant fear that happiness was temporary. Breaking free from them externally was only the beginning. Breaking free internally would take much longer. Still, I held on to the belief that change was possible, that I could reshape the narrative of my life. Looking back, I see that breaking the cycle was not a single act, but 1,000 small ones. It was the courage to take a job, the discipline to save money, the bravery to imagine a different life. It was the strength to believe, even faintly, that I deserved more. Each choice built upon the last, slowly weaving a new pattern to replace the one they had forced upon me. My parents never noticed the shift at first. To them, I was still the daughter trapped in their performance. But inside, I knew I was changing. Their words stung less, their anger held less power, their silence no longer crushed me the way it once had. I was no longer the same child who had stood at that birthday table, humiliated and broken. I was becoming someone else, someone they could not control. Breaking the cycle didn't mean I was healed. It didn't mean the scars disappeared, but it meant that for the first time, I was choosing a different path. And with every step forward, I moved closer to the life I knew I was capable of creating. Rebuilding myself was not a single moment of clarity. It was not one decision, one action, or one sudden transformation. It was slow, fragile, and uneven, like piecing together a shattered mirror one shard at a time, cutting myself along the way but refusing to give up. For years, I had carried the voices of my parents inside me. My father's anger echoed in the way I braced myself for confrontation, even when there was none. My mother's criticism whispered in the mirror every time I looked at my reflection. Their silence, their cruelty, and their approval of my humiliation had seeped so deeply into me that I could no longer separate their voices from my own. To begin rebuilding meant first acknowledging how much of me had been shaped by them, and how much of that shaping I needed to undo. The first step was acknowledging the truth. For most of my life, I had convinced myself that what I endured was normal, that other families must have been similar, that I was simply too weak to handle it. But naming it, abuse, neglect, gaslighting, was the key to unlocking the door I had been trapped behind. It was terrifying to say the words, even silently, because they made everything real. Yet once I said them, I couldn't unsee what they meant. My suffering had not been my fault. The scars I carried were not evidence of weakness, but proof of survival. That understanding gave me the strength to seek help. Therapy was a foreign concept to me at first. I grew up in a family where vulnerability was seen as weakness and asking for help was considered shameful. But I was tired of carrying the weight alone. Sitting across from someone who listened without judgment felt strange in the beginning, as though I was speaking a language I hadn't yet learned. Yet with each session, I began to uncover pieces of myself that I had buried under years of silence. In therapy, I learned that the cruel voice in my head was not truly mine. It was my mother's voice, adopted and repeated until I believed it was my own. I learned that my fear of conflict was not a flaw, but a conditioned response to my father's unpredictable anger. Most importantly, I learned that healing did not mean erasing the past, but reclaiming power in the present. Outside of therapy, I worked on rebuilding my sense of self through small, intentional choices. I surrounded myself with people who saw me differently, people who valued me without conditions. At first, I resisted their kindness, suspecting it was only temporary, waiting for the moment they would turn against me like my family had. But over time, their consistency began to erode my suspicion. They showed me that not every smile hid cruelty, not every act of care disguised manipulation. Trust was not rebuilt overnight, but slowly, I began to believe in the possibility of genuine connection. Work also became a cornerstone of my rebuilding. In my career, I found something my parents had never given me: recognition earned through effort, not taken away by cruelty. Achievements at work were acknowledged, not dismissed. My ideas were considered, not mocked. Each success, no matter how small, became evidence that I was capable and worthy. My parents' definition of me as invisible and unworthy began to lose its grip as I created a new definition for myself. Financial independence played its own powerful role. With every paycheck, I felt freer. The money itself was not the point, it was the autonomy it represented. I could choose where to live, what to eat, what to buy. I could build a life that was mine alone, untouched by their control. Each bill I paid on my own became another brick in the foundation of the new life I was constructing. The process was not without setbacks. There were days when the old voices screamed louder than my new ones. There were nights when I questioned whether I truly deserved happiness, when guilt clawed at me for leaving my family behind. Healing was not a straight line. It was a winding path filled with doubts and regressions. But even in the darkest moments, I reminded myself that progress was measured not by perfection, but by persistence. What surprised me most was how rebuilding myself required learning gentleness. I had been raised in an environment where harshness was constant, so I had internalized the idea that improvement required punishment. If I failed, I berated myself. If I stumbled, I tore myself apart. But rebuilding demanded something different. It demanded patience, compassion, and forgiveness toward myself. I had to learn to treat myself in the way I had always longed to be treated, as someone worthy of care. Self-care became more than a trend or a luxury. It became survival. Allowing myself rest without guilt, pursuing hobbies without justification, even taking walks without purpose. All of it reminded me that I was allowed to exist without constant productivity or punishment. My worth was not tied to how much I endured or how perfectly I performed. My worth existed simply because I existed. That realization was radical in its simplicity. I also rebuilt myself by redefining beauty. For years, my mother had used beauty as a weapon against me, making me feel inadequate, unlovable, invisible. Reclaiming my sense of beauty meant looking in the mirror and seeing myself differently, not through her eyes, but through my own. It wasn't about perfection or comparison. It was about acceptance, about looking at my reflection and saying, "This is me, and I am enough." That shift did not happen overnight, but each time I chose to see myself with kindness instead of cruelty, I weakened her hold on me. Perhaps the most profound part of rebuilding was recognizing the strength I had gained from survival. For so long, I had viewed myself as broken, damaged, and weak. But surviving what I endured required immense resilience. It required adaptability, courage, and determination. Rebuilding meant reframing my past not as evidence of my weakness but as proof of my strength. I had been tested in ways many never are, and I was still here. That survival was not shame, it was triumph. As I rebuilt, I began to dream again. Dreams that once felt impossible began to feel within reach. A safe home, genuine relationships, a fulfilling career. These were no longer fantasies but goals I could work toward. Each step toward those dreams solidified the truth that my parents' voices no longer defined me. Their cycle of cruelty might have shaped my beginning, but it would not dictate my ending. Rebuilding myself was messy, imperfect, and painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I was not living in reaction to their cruelty. I was living in pursuit of my own joy. And in that pursuit, I discovered something they had tried to bury but could never destroy: my ability to rise. Success did not arrive all at once, nor did it come in the way I had once imagined. I used to believe revenge meant seeing my parents suffer the way they had made me suffer, watching them crumble under the weight of their own cruelty. But as the years passed, I realized that revenge, true revenge, was not about hurting them. It was about showing them and myself that they had failed to break me. The greatest revenge was to build a life so full, so whole, so undeniably mine that their voices could no longer echo through it. When I finally stepped away from their house for the last time, I did not slam the door or scream accusations. I walked out quietly, but inside me there was a roar. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they had stolen. I carried nothing but my determination, and though the weight of my past still pressed on my shoulders, I was moving toward a future where that weight would no longer define me. Independence gave me power. Having my own space, no matter how small at first, felt like liberation. The silence in my apartment was different from the silence I had known in their home. This silence was not neglect or complicity. It was peace. It was freedom from criticism, from rage, from humiliation. It was the space I needed to finally hear my own voice. With time, my career blossomed. Every promotion, every opportunity, every accomplishment was another strike against the image of me they had tried to create. They wanted me to be invisible. I became visible. They wanted me to be weak. I became strong. They wanted me to remain trapped in their cycle. I built a life beyond it. Each step forward was proof that their version of me was a lie. But success was not just external. It was internal too. Healing became the truest victory of all. To look in the mirror and see myself not through my mother's cruel lens but through my own eyes was more powerful than any achievement. To trust someone without assuming betrayal, to laugh without bracing for mockery, to celebrate without expecting it to be turned into humiliation, these moments were my triumph. They were the quiet victories that mattered most. There were times I wondered if my parents noticed. Did they see the life I had built? Did they realize that their attempts to break me had failed? In truth, it no longer mattered. My revenge was not dependent on their recognition. My revenge was in the fact that I no longer needed them, no longer sought their approval, no longer allowed their cruelty to define my worth. Their power ended the moment I chose to stop carrying it. What I came to understand was that freedom is not given, it is claimed. And I claimed mine through resilience, persistence, and the refusal to let their cruelty be the final word in my story. For every time they laughed at me, I found reasons to smile for myself. For every time they silenced me, I found new ways to speak. For every time they tried to erase me, I carved my existence deeper into the world. Looking back now, the girl who once stood at the birthday table with cake dripping down her face feels like a different person. She was humiliated, broken, and abandoned by everyone in the room. But she also carried within her the seed of the woman I became. The woman who learned that strength is not born in comfort, but in survival. That humiliation was the moment they thought they had destroyed me. In reality, it was the moment they unknowingly gave me the fire to rebuild. My story is not one of vengeance through pain, but one of vindication through growth. Success became my shield, healing became my sword, and freedom became my crown. My parents gave me scars, but those scars became the map that led me to who I am today. They may have shaped my beginning, but I alone determined my ending. And so, I live my life now not in the shadow of what they did to me, but in the light of what I created despite them. Every laugh, every moment of peace, every accomplishment is proof that they failed. My existence, full and whole, is the revenge they never saw coming. If you are listening to this and have ever felt broken by those who should have loved you, know this: your story does not have to end in the place it began. You can build something new. You can rise beyond what tried to destroy you. You can make your life the revenge that speaks louder than their cruelty ever could. I was once the invisible daughter, the scapegoat, the target of laughter. Today, I am none of those things. Today, I am free. And if my parents ever think back to that birthday where they shoved me into a cake and mocked me, I hope they realize what they created was not the broken child they wanted, but the resilient woman they never expected. Because the greatest revenge is not cruelty returned. The greatest revenge is happiness they cannot touch, success they cannot take, and peace they cannot ruin. And that is exactly what I have now. So, if you're still here with me at the end of my story, I want to thank you. And I'll leave you with this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. I read every comment. And remember, if you subscribe, you will have luck in your life.